It is the voice of a man speaking while being hunted inside his own country. In the early hours following Uganda's January 15th elections, opposition leader Bobi Wine described a scene that sounds less like an election aftermath and more like a military operation. Police officers and unidentified men in plain clothes climbed over his fence using ladders. Electricity was cut, surveillance cameras were disabled, and above his home a helicopter hovered in the darkness providing light as the raid unfolded below. His wife remained trapped inside. He escaped barely. As he spoke, Bobi Wine made one thing clear: the results being announced by the Electoral Commission did not reflect what happened at the polling stations. He accused the authorities of arresting opposition agents, stuffing ballots, and shutting down the internet to prevent Ugandans and the world from seeing the truth in real time. According to him, what was happening on the ground was completely different from what officials were declaring on television. This is the Uganda of 2026, a country where soldiers filled the streets before a single ballot was cast, a country where the internet went dark nationwide, a country where peaceful protesters were reportedly shot dead in multiple towns simply for demanding transparency. And yet, at the same time, official statements continue to describe the electoral process as largely peaceful. Uganda has been ruled for nearly 4 decades by Yoweri Museveni. To his supporters, he represents stability. To his critics, he represents the slow suffocation of democratic space. The question now is no longer who won the election, but whether elections still mean anything at all in a system guarded by guns. So we must ask if an opposition leader can be hunted after an election, if the internet can be shut off to hide the count, and if civilians can be killed for protesting. What does democracy really look like in Uganda today? And just as importantly, how long will the international community continue to look away? If you believe the truth matters more than official statements, please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe. And most importantly, tell us in the comments, do you believe Uganda's election reflected the will of the people or the will of power? To understand what unfolded in Uganda after January 15, 2026, we must first understand the environment in which the election itself took place. This was not an ordinary democratic contest. Long before ballots were cast, the country had already shifted into a posture of confrontation. Streets were secured not by election volunteers, but by armed personnel. The atmosphere across Kampala and other major urban centers felt tense, controlled, and militarized. President Yoweri Museveni, who has ruled Uganda for nearly 4 decades, entered the 2026 election as the incumbent and the clear favorite of the state apparatus. His dominance over the military security services and electoral institutions was already well established. For many Ugandans, the central question was not whether Museveni would be declared the winner, but whether the people's vote would be allowed to speak at all. On election day, polling stations opened under heavy security presence. Soldiers and police officers were visible at nearly every location. While officials later described this as a measure to ensure order, critics argue that the show of force had a chilling effect on voters. In a country with a long memory of political violence, the presence of armed men near ballot boxes sends a powerful and unmistakable message. The situation escalated rapidly after polls closed. Almost immediately, reports began to surface of opposition polling agents being detained or blocked from performing their duties. According to opposition accounts, some tally sheets never made it out of polling stations, while others were allegedly altered during transportation. These accusations strike at the very heart of electoral credibility because, without independent verification, results become little more than official declarations. Then came one of the most decisive actions of the entire election: the nationwide internet shutdown. On January 30th, public access to the internet was suspended, effectively cutting Uganda off from the rest of the world. Social media platforms, messaging services, and independent reporting channels went dark. Citizens could no longer upload videos, share photos, or document events in real time. In the modern age, shutting down the internet during an election is not a technical decision, it is a political one. For the opposition, this blackout was not incidental. Bobi Wine, the main challenger to Museveni, argued that the internet shutdown was designed to prevent the publication of declaration forms and district tally sheets. These documents, he insisted, would reveal results drastically different from those being announced by the Electoral Commission. Without internet access, ordinary Ugandans were forced to rely entirely on state-controlled channels for information. As official results began to trickle out, the Electoral Commission declared that President Museveni was leading by a significant margin. Yet these announcements came amid widespread reports of arrests, intimidation, and violent dispersal of protests. In multiple towns, civilians attempting to demonstrate peacefully were reportedly met with live ammunition. Deaths were recorded in several districts, with families left grieving and demanding answers. What makes this moment especially troubling is the timing. Violence did not erupt weeks later after political tensions had cooled. It erupted immediately at the very moment citizens sought clarity and transparency. The state's response to dissent was swift and forceful, reinforcing the perception that the election outcome was being protected not by law, but by coercion. For many Ugandans, the sequence of events followed a familiar pattern: military deployment, restricted information, contested results, and suppression of protest. What was different in 2026 was the scale and coordination. The combination of physical force and digital silence created a near-total blackout of independent verification. In such conditions, even the most carefully written electoral laws become meaningless. This is the core of the main event: an election conducted under the shadow of armed power, followed by an information shutdown and sealed with disputed declarations. Whether one supports or opposes President Museveni, these facts raise a fundamental question that cannot be ignored. Can an election be called free and fair when the people are watched by soldiers, silenced by blackouts, and answered with bullets? The story of Uganda's 2026 election does not begin with who won. It begins with how the vote was controlled, how information was restricted, and how dissent was punished. And it is from this foundation that the crisis truly unfolds. The crisis in Uganda did not reach its peak at the polling stations. It reached its climax in the dead of night when the election moved from ballots to brute force and from counting rooms to living rooms. This was the moment when the political conflict became deeply personal, embodied in one man's escape and a nation's fear. In the hours after the elections, Bobi Wine released a message that sent shockwaves across the country and far beyond its borders. Speaking as a man under siege, he described how security forces descended on his home. Police officers, assisted by unidentified men in plain clothes, used ladders to scale his fence. Electricity was cut. Surveillance cameras were deliberately disabled. Above the compound, a helicopter hovered, illuminating the scene from the sky. This was not crowd control. This was a targeted operation. In the chaos, Bobi Wine managed to escape. His wife and family members were not so fortunate. They remained trapped under house arrest as soldiers secured the perimeter. From that moment on, Bobi Wine became a fugitive in his own country, constantly moving, avoiding capture, knowing full well that security forces were actively hunting him. The question was no longer theoretical, would he be arrested again or worse? But even while in hiding, he spoke directly to the people of Uganda. His message was unequivocal. He rejected the results being announced by the Electoral Commission, calling them fake and insisting they bore no resemblance to what happened at the polling stations. According to him, the regime had followed a familiar script: arrest, opposition agents stuff ballots, shut down the internet, and then declare victory behind closed doors. Central to his demand was transparency. Bobi Wine called for the immediate restoration of the internet so that district declaration forms and tally sheets could be uploaded for public scrutiny. Without this, he argued the election could not be considered legitimate. He urged Ugandans to resist any attempt to subvert their voices and to do so non-violently, even in the face of provocation. As his message spread by word of mouth and limited offline channels, the streets began to respond. Protests erupted in multiple parts of the country. Ordinary citizens, many of them young, took to the streets to reject what they believed was an openly rigged process. What followed, according to numerous reports, was devastating. In several towns, police opened fire on protesters. Entire families were left mourning. Names, numbers, and locations varied, but the pattern was consistent. Civilians were being killed for demanding accountability. These deaths marked the emotional high point of the crisis. This was no longer a dispute over numbers on a screen. This was blood on the ground. The cost of political disagreement had become lethal. And yet, at the same time, official channels continued uninterrupted. The Electoral Commission, led by Zvakaoma, pressed on with announcing results as though the country were calm and orderly. Then came the most jarring contrast of all. While opposition leaders spoke of raids, killings, and suppression, regional observer missions released statements describing the electoral environment as largely peaceful. Security forces, they said, had acted professionally. Polling stations, they claimed, had operated transparently. For many Ugandans watching from the ground, this felt like a second betrayal, not only by their government, but by those tasked with bearing witness. The reaction was one of disbelief and anger. How could an election be labeled peaceful when opposition leaders were in hiding and civilians lay dead? How could transparency be praised when the internet was shut down at the most critical moment? These contradictions fueled a growing sense that two realities were unfolding simultaneously. One lived by the people, and another recorded in official reports. This was the true climax of Uganda's post-election crisis: a hunted opposition leader, a grieving population, and an institutional response that appeared detached from the human cost. In that collision between lived experience and official narrative, the legitimacy of the entire process began to unravel. Uganda was no longer simply counting votes. It was confronting a far more dangerous question when power feels threatened. How far will it go to protect itself? And who will speak for the people when guns drown out their voices? When the dust began to settle after the raids, the shootings, and the contested declarations, Uganda was left facing consequences far deeper than a disputed election result. What unfolded in the days that followed was not just a political crisis, it was a rupture in the social contract between the state and its citizens. For ordinary Ugandans, the immediate consequence was fear. Fear of speaking openly, fear of gathering in public, fear that any form of dissent, even peaceful protest, could be met with lethal force. Families who had sent their sons and daughters to demonstrate returned home with devastating news. In several communities, funerals replaced rallies and grief replaced hope. These were not armed rebels or violent mobs. They were civilians demanding transparency, and they paid with their lives. Beyond the human toll, trust collapsed. Elections are meant to be moments when citizens temporarily suspend skepticism and believe that institutions will reflect their collective will. In 2026, that belief was shattered for many Ugandans. The arrest of opposition agents, the shutdown of the internet, and the continuation of result announcements amid bloodshed sent a clear message: the process mattered less than the outcome. Once that perception takes root, democracy itself begins to lose meaning. Politically, the aftermath hardened positions on all sides. Supporters of the ruling establishment argued that stability must be preserved at all costs, even if it required strong security measures. They pointed to decades of leadership under Yoweri Museveni as proof that order and continuity were preferable to uncertainty. To them, protests represented chaos, not civic engagement. But for the opposition and a growing segment of the population, particularly young people, the events of 2026 confirmed a darker reality. They saw a system unwilling to reform, unwilling to compete fairly, and increasingly reliant on force. Politics, in their eyes, was no longer a contest of ideas, but a managed process guarded by weapons. This realization carries long-term risks. When peaceful political participation appears futile, frustration can harden into radicalization or apathy, both dangerous outcomes for any nation. Institutions also suffered lasting damage. The Electoral Commission's credibility was severely undermined among large portions of the public. Courts, which traditionally serve as avenues for resolving electoral disputes, faced skepticism about their independence. Media outlets, already constrained, became even more cautious, aware that challenging official narratives could invite retaliation. In this environment, accountability mechanisms weakened just when they were needed most. Internationally, Uganda's image shifted. Once viewed as a stable partner in a volatile region, it now appeared increasingly authoritarian. The contrast between glowing observer statements and images of grieving families raised uncomfortable questions for regional bodies and foreign governments alike. Silence or vague calls for restraint were interpreted by many Ugandans as tacit approval. This perception risks deepening resentment not only toward domestic authorities, but toward international actors who claim to champion democratic values. Perhaps the most profound consequence lies in generational memory. Older Ugandans remember past eras of turmoil and hoped elections would prevent a return to repression. Younger Ugandans, many voting for the first or second time, witnessed their democratic aspirations collide with batons and bullets. That experience will shape how they view politics for decades to come. In the end, the true cost of Uganda's post-election crisis cannot be measured solely in casualties or court cases. It is measured in broken trust, silenced voices, and a widening gap between rulers and the ruled. An election may end in a matter of days, but the damage done to legitimacy, unity, and faith in peaceful change can linger for generations. Uganda now stands at a crossroads, not just between political factions, but between two futures. One where power continues to entrench itself through force, and another where accountability, however painful, is allowed to take root. Which path is chosen will determine far more than who occupies the presidential office. From Washington to Addis Ababa, from international newsrooms to diplomatic briefing rooms, the crisis unfolding in Uganda has placed the global community in an uncomfortable spotlight. This is not just a regional dispute or an internal political disagreement. It is a test of principles of consistency and of whether democracy is defended only when it is convenient. For decades, the United States has positioned itself as a global advocate for democratic governance, transparency, and peaceful transitions of power. American officials regularly speak about free and fair elections as the foundation of stability. Yet when elections are contested in strategically important countries, the response often becomes cautious, measured, and deliberately vague. Uganda is a prime example of this dilemma. On one hand, Uganda has long been regarded by Washington as a security partner in East Africa. It plays a role in regional military operations, counterterrorism efforts, and peacekeeping missions. On the other hand, the images emerging from Uganda soldiers in residential areas, internet blackouts, opposition leaders in hiding, civilians shot during protests stand in stark contrast to the values the United States claims to promote. This contradiction has not gone unnoticed. For many observers, especially older Americans who lived through the Cold War and witnessed the consequences of supporting strongmen in the name of stability, Uganda's situation feels uncomfortably familiar. History has shown that prioritizing short-term order over democratic accountability often leads to long-term instability. The question now is whether that lesson has truly been learned. At the United Nations, reactions have followed a predictable pattern: calls for restraint, appeals for dialogue, carefully worded statements urging all sides to remain calm. What is often missing, however, is a direct acknowledgement of the imbalance of power on the ground. When one side controls the military, the police, the Electoral Commission, and the flow of information, dialogue can quickly become a hollow word. Regional organizations face similar challenges. The African Union and sub-regional bodies must balance respect for national sovereignty with their stated commitment to democratic norms. Observer missions, while valuable in theory, risk losing credibility when their assessments appear disconnected from lived realities. When international reports describe elections as largely peaceful while funerals are taking place, public trust in those institutions erodes not just in Uganda but across the continent. Global media coverage has also played a crucial role. In an era of constant information overload, crises in Africa often struggle to maintain sustained attention. Without dramatic geopolitical stakes or direct Western involvement, stories like Uganda's can fade quickly from headlines. Yet for the people living through it, the consequences are permanent. Silence, intentional or not, becomes a form of complicity. For American audiences, this moment invites reflection. Democracy is not merely a system to be exported or evaluated from afar. It is a fragile process that requires vigilance, especially when it is under threat. If the United States and its allies respond selectively, condemning abuses in some countries while excusing them in others, the moral authority of democratic advocacy weakens. Uganda's crisis forces a difficult but necessary question onto the global stage. Are democratic principles universal, or are they negotiable? If elections can be militarized, information can be shut down, and protesters can be killed without meaningful consequences, what message does that send to other governments watching closely? The world is watching Uganda, but Uganda is also watching the world. And what it sees may shape not only its own future, but the future of democratic movements far beyond its borders. As the cameras fade and the headlines move on, the question Uganda now faces is not who won the election, but what kind of future remains possible after it. Elections are meant to close political chapters. In Uganda's case, the 2026 vote opened a far more dangerous one. At the center of this storm stands Bobby Wine, a man forced into hiding for challenging a system that has ruled for nearly 4 decades. His escape from a militarized raid, the continued house arrest of his family, and the deaths of civilians protesting peacefully are not isolated incidents. They are symptoms of a deeper crisis, one where power no longer feels accountable to the people it governs. Supporters of the government will argue that stability must come first. They will say that strong measures are necessary to prevent chaos. But history, especially history familiar to many older Americans, teaches a sobering lesson. Stability enforced by fear is never stable for long. When citizens lose faith in ballots, they eventually lose faith in institutions. And when that happens, nations drift towards cycles of repression, unrest, and unpredictability. Uganda's long-serving president, Yoweri Museveni, has often been described as a symbol of continuity in a turbulent region. But continuity without accountability comes at a cost. Each election contested under military shadow, each internet blackout, each unanswered death deepens the divide between ruler and ruled. Over time, that divide becomes impossible to bridge peacefully. The warning here extends far beyond Uganda. Across Africa, and indeed across the world, governments are watching closely. They are studying what happens when elections are disputed, when protests are crushed, and when international reactions remain muted. If the lesson they learn is that power can be preserved through force without consequence, then Uganda will not be the last country to walk this path. For the international community, and particularly for the United States, this moment demands more than carefully worded statements. It demands honesty. Democracy cannot be defended selectively. Human rights cannot be conditional. And elections cannot be considered legitimate simply because they are orderly on paper while chaotic on the ground. For Ugandans, the struggle now enters a quieter, more difficult phase. It is the phase where fear lingers, where grief is processed, and where choices about resistance, reform, or resignation are made behind closed doors. The courage shown by ordinary citizens, those who protested, documented, and spoke out despite the risks, will shape the country's future far more than any official declaration. And for you watching from afar, this story is not distant. It is a reminder that democracy, once taken for granted, can erode faster than we imagine. It survives only when people are willing to defend it, not just with words, but with attention, pressure, and solidarity. If you believe that elections should reflect the will of the people, not the will of power, please share this video. Subscribe if you believe the truth matters more than official narratives. And tell us in the comments, do you think Uganda's democracy can still be restored, or has